Good evening, and thank you for joining us. My name is Ryan Burrows, Executive Director of the American Kratom Association. We're also joined this evening by Mac Haddo, our Senior Fellow on Public Policy. We scheduled this very important meeting this evening to discuss with you the latest coming out of Louisiana. We will also update you on the other key states that we are active in, and we will discuss the FDA's latest disinformation campaign. Mac, I will turn it over to you, and for our audience, the Q&A is open for your questions.
Thank you. And before we get into the specific updates on these hotspot states that we're dealing in, let me just reflect a little on some of the successes we've had and where we're currently active and some of our failures, frankly, that we run into, and an explanation as to why we've encountered those problems. This year in this legislative session, we've obviously done very well in West Virginia, Texas, and Florida. Today, the legislature actually sent the Kratom Consumer Protection Act to Governor DeSantis, and he has until I think the 7th of June to sign it, but it's our understanding that he's going to do that. And obviously that's a great step forward in the state of Florida. That would bring us to 11 states who have enacted the Kratom Consumer Protection Act. I think it's also important to tell everyone that we have a bill that was filed for interim study in the state of Arkansas. And everyone should read that bill and the findings that are proposed for the legislature to adopt, because I think it encapsulates the battle that we're in. We'll circulate that legislation. It goes to what's called an interim study committee, and it directly challenges the decision made by the Arkansas Department of Health to schedule Kratom in the first place. And I think it's informative, but it shows you an advancement in terms of the passage by the committee that oversees the interim studies for the Arkansas legislature. So I think that we can count that as a great step forward there in a state that we all know has been very difficult, because originally the only basis that the Arkansas Department of Health had in scheduling Kratom was a complaint by one doctor who was an addiction recovery specialist. That is documented in the file that the Arkansas Department of Health has as the basis for their scheduling Kratom, which of course was supported by the FDA disinformation campaign that was heavily relied upon at that time. So far this year, we have some additional states that we continue to work in to promote the Kratom Consumer Protection Act. And let me just quickly run through those. Massachusetts, Rhode Island, New York, New Jersey, Ohio, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Louisiana. We're going to talk about a couple of those states here in more detail in just a minute. But in those 9 or 10 states that are left, still gives us a great opportunity to share the message about how Kratom should be regulated and how bans are simply ineffective. We have proposed bans that we were able to address this year in Montana, and I'll discuss that one a little later, South Carolina, West Virginia, Tennessee, Missouri, Mississippi, and Louisiana. In Louisiana, we know that those ban bills are still active. We're fighting hard in these states in order to fight back. And then, of course, we have the FDA's disinformation impact and what it materially has done in the states that we've been working. We know that in the state of Missouri, the FDA actually contacted the governor's office and told them that Kratom was federally illegal. They've continued that disinformation campaign to this day. When I met with the Department of Health in Missouri, they literally said that that's the confirmation that they had received from the Food and Drug Administration. It's false and it should not be tolerated, and we're pushing hard in that area. We know that the FDA has also worked actively in Minnesota, South Carolina, Tennessee, Kansas, Hawaii, Mississippi, and Louisiana. They are active in all levels, both in social media surveillance and in actively looking at these legislative activities that are going on and reaching out to legislators and to the public health authorities in those states in order to mislead them into joining the FDA's campaign that's anti-Kratom. In the states where we saw the proposed ban, let me give you one example of how badly misinformed some legislative bodies can be. In the state of Montana, a ban bill emerged at the last minute, and usually it takes weeks and weeks to have the bill filed, to have a bill assigned to a committee, to have a scheduled vote on the committee for the public hearing. Some states have multiple hearings on each bill. What happened in Montana was that the Senate President Ellsworth, arranged for Kratom to be added to the drug control bill that was going through the Senate Judiciary Committee. It is a bill that each year they add substances that are identified by the DEA as being scheduled products, and they simply add them to the Montana drug rule list. In this case, that's not in any way true, and yet the Senate President, whom I had the opportunity to sit down and speak with in a meeting of the National Conference of State Legislators this past weekend, he told me that he was asked by the Department of Revenue in the state of Montana, who had been told by the FDA how dangerous this product was and that it simply had to be added. And so President Ellsworth signed off. By his description, President Ellsworth said, I just wanted it to be 18 and under in terms of purchase, but the Department of Revenue said the FDA told them that this was a highly dangerous product and needed to be scheduled in the state of Montana. It passed out of committee. That evening, several hours later, it went to what's called second reading. Usually bills have to go through introduction and then a second reading and a third reading. Within 24 hours, they did the third reading on the Senate floor, and it literally passed out, believe it was on a Thursday, left us scrambling over the weekend in order to hire lobbyists and to do a massive information campaign to help the legislature in the Montana House of Representatives. The vote, as all of you know, was 100-0 to resist the Senate amendment. When I talked to President Ellsworth, he admitted that he was surprised. He admitted that that wouldn't happen, except for there being a very strong campaign that we were able, obviously, to launch. And he showed respect for that. He said, you wouldn't have done that had there not been some truth behind it. And so he has now agreed that he's going to look hard at the Kratom Consumer Protection Act, which goes beyond his desire to have an 18-year and up, or I'm sorry, an 18-year age limit on the purchase of Kratom. It shows you, it illustrates how two things. One is how powerful the FDA is, and secondly, how powerful our advocacy efforts are, because it wasn't just hiring the lobbyist, but it was motivating and launching our advocacy campaign, which made a dramatic difference there in the state of Montana. We can replicate that. We can continue to do it. And we're right now in the battle in Louisiana. There are 2 ban bills that are under consideration in the Louisiana legislature. And let me tell you the backstory on exactly how pervasive this power is that the FDA has. We met with both sponsors, Senator Kleinpeter of the Senate ban bill in Louisiana and Representative Furman. Both of them were open to the discussion. In fact, Senator Kleinpeter, after he heard the evidence in the hearing that was provided by both the American Kratom Association and then by the number of people that were there to testify regarding the Kratom issue, including John Schintzholzer, Jim Carroll, the former drug czar, and we had Jack Henningfield there. After that testimony, the Senate panel instructed Senator Kleinpeter to work with the American Kratom Association in order to work out a regulation bill rather than the ban. Senator Kleinpeter agreed. We stood in the hallway outside of that hearing room, and we committed that we were going to work together in order to find whatever compromises he felt were necessary in order to allow for the bill to be converted from a ban bill to a regulation bill. We shook hands on it. We then went over and he asked me to go and talk to Representative Furman, who was carrying the ban bill over on the House side. I did so. On repeated meetings with Representative Furman, where he consistently said that Senator Kleinpeter was on board and that he was speaking for the 2 of them, we negotiated a compromise bill that included some things that were helpful to them that we weren't particularly fond of, but in the legislative process, it is a part of compromising. We found that middle ground, we agreed to it, and specifically agreed to some amendments. What happened in the House hearing was another part of the legislative process where individual House members offered amendments that were accepted, that were counter to the things we like, but they were acceptable in the big picture. As we left that meeting, Representative Furman again agreed that we were on solid ground, that he would support us and he would not pursue his ban bill. When the Kratom Consumer Protection Act was first introduced a couple of days ago on the floor of the Louisiana House. At the same time as that was happening, there was a action taken by Senator Kleinpeter on the floor of the Senate, where it passed unanimously to support his ban bill. That was a specific violation of the agreement that we had. That handshake means nothing, obviously, in the state of Louisiana. His explanation for doing so, and you can all watch it, it was absurd. It was full of misinformation and misstatements about the actual composition of Kratom and its impact on the community. No question that much of what he described was a part of an unregulated marketplace where you have adulterated products. But the integrity of this process now falls into question because of those actions. And we relied to our detriment on the commitments made by an elected official. We're obviously going to have to resolve that. But we're in play in Louisiana because Representative Furman appears to have kept his commitment that he is not going to pursue a ban on the House bill. Our Kratom Consumer Protection Act was up for consideration last night. There were attacks on our bill about a provision that provided for local parishes to be able to enact more restrictive rules under the state law as long as they did so by September 1st. And there were strong objections that were raised about that provision. And so we've stripped that amendment out. Our belief is that the power of the science will prevail. We'll have to live with having to fight in individual parishes. But I can tell you that in conversations that I have had, and Ryan has had similar conversations with the local parish elected officials, they wanted some kind of regulatory scheme, but they didn't have the ability to do it without the state acting. And so they're looking to the state for some direction. And I think several of those 6 parishes that have already banned Kratom will step back and adopt a regulatory scheme. And by the way, why wouldn't they? Because obviously those parishes, if you live in one parish, you just have to drive across the parish line to buy a legal, well-regulated Kratom product, you'll do so. I think that this is an exercise that is critically important for the Kratom community to move forward in Louisiana. And we're hopeful that tomorrow, when the Kratom Consumer Protection Act is presented on the floor of the Louisiana House, that reason will prevail, and then we'll be able to haggle it out between the regulatory approach and the ban bill that currently was passed by the Senate under the sponsorship of Senator Kleinpeter. Everyone should be alert to some advocacy campaigns that we're going to launch that will obviously target the Senate bill, which will be considered by the House Judiciary Committee as we go forward. I think it's called the Administrative Judiciary Committee, but we'll inform you on who you should be contacting here in the next day or so once we see how the Kratom Consumer Protection Act actually is handled by the Louisiana House on the floor. There is no question that the sheriffs in Louisiana are spreading the FDA disinformation campaign, and that is the fight that we're having because they don't even rationally connect the truth to any of the claims that they make about Kratom. And I'll tell you another example of that kind of disinformation having an impact was in Hawaii, where we had a strong list of supporters and sponsors of the KCPA, and yet you had one committee chairman who was operating under the misimpression based on a conversation she'd had with a regional FDA official about what Kratom is and how it acts in the body. And so just this past weekend, I had a conversation with the new Hawaii House of Representatives Health and Human Services Committee Chairman, who is committed to carry our bill, has committed to convene a legislative briefing on Kratom and to schedule up talk show discussions in August, all in preparation for the KCPA being filed. And the Senate president committed that he will make sure that the Senate handles it and addresses it as well. So we'll get a vote over there without being stopped by some committee chairman. So I think that those are all positive things, but explain why we have to be prepared to continue our fight in this battle against the FDA. And let me just talk for a minute about what the FDA is up to these days. Many of you know that they maintain very vigorous social media surveillance teams. They are watching every single thing that's happening on the internet with respect to Kratom. They are using that information in some cases against us because, unfortunately, some of our advocates are republishing anti-Kratom information that the FDA is now pointing to as evidence of how even within the Kratom advocacy community, there's this dissension, which mischaracterizes the purpose for which this information is reposted. So I would advise everyone that's involved in our effort to be careful about reposting of negative information, which I know is intended to help inform people to illustrate on the mistakes that are being made in this space, but it's being used, and I would argue abused by the FDA to mischaracterize the purpose for which this information is actually being circulated. I am aware that the FDA has now used information that they are harvesting from the internet and from specific anti-Kratom pages where they're reaching out to these critics and interviewing them, trying to get information specifically about alleged deaths that are attributable to Kratom from loved ones. And let me hasten to add here, if you are a family member who has lost a family member to what the medical examiner and the coroner have improperly characterized as a Kratom death, because those coroners and medical examiners are listening to the FDA and not following the science, I understand where a family might grieve and might say that, oh, well, it was Kratom because my medical examiner and my coroner said so. Without exception, we have asked for, and for every autopsy and toxicology screen that we have been able to obtain, either through FOIA or from individuals who claim to have lost a family member, we've had them reviewed by an independent forensics toxicologist, and always it has been either a polydrug death or it has been a drug interaction death with unrelated to Kratom, or perhaps Kratom and with that drug, which obviously we're concerned about, and if it's true, we need to examine, and it's been underlying health conditions that have nothing to do with Kratom. But wherever you fall on that spectrum, and by the way, the Secretary of Health and Human Services, Secretary Becerra, falls in the camp of saying these are polydrug use or adulterated Kratom products. That's where he falls. It is where the National Institutes on Drug Abuse falls. It is where WebMD falls. All recognize the truth of it. And by the way, it is where the Centers for Disease Control falls, because they've examined specific deaths. And I see the headline all the time that says 91 deaths, according to CDC, were attributable to Kratom. That is not true. If you read the article, and very rarely do people do that, if you read the report issued by the Centers for Disease Control, what they say is that 91 deaths were identified by medical examiners and coroners as Kratom-associated deaths. And in each case, they found other substances led by fentanyl, then morphine, cocaine, buprenorphine, and a list of other substances that have deadly toxic levels that were ingested concurrently or in a relatively short space of time with a Kratom product. The CDC report identified only 7 deaths reported by medical examiners and coroners that were attributable to Kratom alone. The CDC then went and asked for blood samples for those 7 deaths from the medical examiners and the coroners. And what they found for the 4 blood samples that were available and were provided to the CDC, those 4 deaths that were called by the medical examiner or coroner as Kratom only actually were multiple substances, polydrug use, or an adulterated Kratom product, because after the death's done, you don't know, unless you have the product, whether it was an adulterated product or not. But they found fentanyl and morphine and heroin in those 4 of those deaths. 3 didn't have any blood samples. So the bottom line here is that there is no known toxic level of Kratom that will cause an overdose death. None that is known after extensive reviews, multiple hundreds of autopsy reports, and even NMS Labs, which is the premier lab organization in the country that does laboratory testing for law enforcement agencies, coroners, and medical examiners. Even they acknowledge that they cannot identify a toxic level for Kratom, and they've reviewed hundreds and hundreds of autopsy reports. So this is made up fiction that is determined by the FDA, influencing medical examiners and coroners to list Kratom as a metrogeny and intoxication death. Now, for those that disagree with that position, there's a simple solution. Submit the autopsy report in a tox screen. We will be completely transparent. We'll send it, or we'll provide the address to send that information to an independent third-party forensic toxicologist. We'll pay for it, and we'll see what the truth is. Because at the bottom line, everybody's entitled to the truth. Those families that are involved in these tragic circumstances who have lost a loved one should know the truth. And the public should know the truth and not be subject to the claims being made, however well-intentioned, but misplaced because they relied upon the FDA campaign on disinformation. And if anyone doubts that the FDA does this, that they actually engage in campaigns of disinformation, I can give you a prime example of where they do it, where they're stone cold guilty, and yet they won't acknowledge it. And that came when you look at what Secretary Gottlieb said on September 13th of 2018. Now, the date's important, but he made a public statement in reference to unapproved Kratom products that were being marketed with unauthorized opioid withdrawal and addiction claims about therapies, which, by the way, is an important issue, and I'll get to that in 1 second. But this is what he said. He said, well, it's important to generate more evidence. There is evidence that certain substances found in Kratom are opioids, and data suggests that one or more may have a potential for abuse. He said that almost a month after the Assistant Secretary for Health, Dr. Brett Giroir, had issued a blistering withdrawal of the recommendation for scheduling of Kratom from the DEA that had been submitted by the Food and Drug Administration that was signed off by Dr. Gottlieb. Now, the reason that Dr. Gottlieb could tell the lie that he told on September 13th of 2018 about the characterization of Kratom was because he blocked Secretary Giroir's letter from being made public. And the reason that we didn't know about that letter for 2.5 years was because the FDA invoked under the federal FOIA law, the Freedom of Information Act law, the ongoing regulatory review exception, meaning that they asserted that they were going to continue to review the Kratom issue, and therefore the letter that withdrew Kratom from being scheduled was held from public view. And it wasn't until 2.5 years later that we found out what really happened. And what we found out was that Scott Gottlieb went on, even on the air, using the power of the pulpit of the FDA, and told America that these certain substances in Kratom are opioids. What does that tell you? They're opioids, therefore they are dangerous, therefore they are killing people. They let you fill in the blanks. And Dr. Gottlieb knew exactly what he was doing. And yet he got away with it because he knew that the truth was being hidden by his hand from the public view of our being able to look at it. Dr. Giroir, after the letter was made public and he got into a public Twitter battle back and forth with Scott Gottlieb, said the following. He said that the submission from the FDA was based on disappointingly poor evidence and data and a failure to consider the overall public health. The FDA could not justify on a scientific basis using the criteria established by the statute called the 8-factor analysis, cannot justify scheduling of Kratom. And it wasn't just the DEA that rejected it. It was also Health and Human Services and the Expert Committee on Drug Dependence, 12 international experts applying a lower standard for scheduling under the UN Commission on Narcotic Drugs, of which we're a treaty. And they let the FDA have an advantage at that point with a lower standard, and even then they couldn't meet it. Independent experts, 12 of them unanimously said that there was insufficient evidence to schedule Kratom, even at that lesser standard. But the truth doesn't matter to the FDA. Only their selfish political regulatory agenda that they want to promote. And that's what we are all victims of. And unfortunately, those who are led to believe that their loved ones passed away because of metrogenine intoxication are victims of that disinformation campaign by the US Food and Drug Administration as well. The FDA has actually had the audacity to publish what they call the FDA rumors page. I want everyone to go take a look at it. What they are talking about is disinformation on health issues that were being circulated relative to the COVID virus. They thought that there were lots of therapies being promoted. And by the way, I agree. I think they should be taken down. But the FDA also then talks about the opioid epidemic and the drug overdose epidemic, and they want disinformation removed from that too. They know, they being the FDA, they know that what they're saying is not scientifically grounded, but rather is only their opinion. And guess what? They're not entitled to their opinion when it comes to a public health issue, because Nora Volkow, based on $30 million of science that she has invested in on our behalf at the National Institute on Drug Abuse, has demonstrated that Kratom is, in fact, not schedulable and is a valuable harm reduction tool for those people that are struggling with addictions and drug abuse problems. And we've saved lives by using Kratom. And what the FDA is doing is actually costing lives. And that was, of course, articulated eloquently by Dr. Jawad when he talked about the consequences of scheduling a product. The FDA today is engaged in that disinformation campaign, and the hypocrisy of their FDA rumors page is stunning in terms of its arrogance and its disconnect with the American public and the view and the actual authority that they are supposed to fulfill in protecting the public health of Americans. They are the lone wolf in Washington on the Kratom issue, and we simply have to fight back. Stay tuned for a counter website that we hope will be published soon and put up, where we can report the FDA's disinformation campaign, as they are asking us to report the disinformation being circulated on dietary supplements and on Kratom. And we'll make sure that we hold them accountable in the same way that they're trying to hold accountable those people that are obviously abusing the public realm by giving disinformation. And by the way, if the FDA really had any integrity on this issue, then why wouldn't they go after the companies in the Kratom space who are illegally marketing Kratom products, claiming that it helps you get off of opioids or helps you avoid an opioid overdose? That's their job. That's what they're doing, and they're complaining about in the COVID space. That's what they're complaining about. The dietary supplements are being used for that purpose, and yet the AKA has, through its Truth and Labeling program, sent more than 75 complaints over the last almost 3 years now to the FDA, fully documenting the companies that are abusing that, who are using illegal therapeutic claims, illegal under federal law, which the FDA is duty bound to interdict, and the very thing they're claiming on the rumors page needs to be done, and not a single prosecution, not one. And yet they're willing to go out and prosecute on their import alert, which is their pocket ban on Kratom, and they'll find companies that are manufacturing safe Kratom products, and they'll attack them on the flimsy basis that these are products that are presumptively adulterated because they haven't been subject to a new dietary ingredient notification, which is the law under DSHEA, the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act, that says that any dietary ingredient or food that was not in commerce prior to October 15th of 1994 has to have an NDIN. Now, here's the Gordian knot. Here's the trick box. Here's the catch-22. You can't get an NDIN without FDA accepting it and allowing it to be registered. And the FDA has turned down every NDIN application that has been submitted to the FDA over the last 6 years. They are the judge, jury, and executioner. And it's simply wrong that they have that authority to create and abuse their import alert and NDIN authority in order to create a pocket ban that they can't justify on the science. They use their opinion, their bias against all dietary supplements and Kratom products in the United States. We have to stand up and fight. We're going to work on providing some tools to more effectively deliver that message to Washington. So I ask everyone to stand by and help us with that. The bottom line is that we are working hard, really hard, to make sure that we protect all of us. I know that there are critics in the Kratom advocacy community, as there are with the Kratom Danger Awareness Group, that they demonize the AKA, they demonize me personally. And by the way, they're entitled to do that if they can back it up with the facts. But we have people in our own community that are spreading disinformation as well. I'll give you an example. There was recently a post that got some attention among the Kratom advocacy groups that warned about Indonesia. And this individual, who has a self-interest because the company that they represent benefits from this run on people being concerned about the source of supply from Indonesia. Our problem is the FDA import alert, not the Indonesian government. There is no question that there is an effort over in Indonesia, just like we have here in the United States, by some regulatory bodies, in this case, the BNN, which is the Indonesian equivalent of the DEA, who has the authority to look at some products, and they've announced that they want to ban Kratom as of 2024. They do not have the authority unilaterally to do that any more than the FDA can schedule here in the United States a Kratom product. They can't do it. And anyone who suggests to the contrary is inflaming the public inappropriately and spreading their own disinformation. And I would ask you to ignore those people. Look at their self-interest. Look at their anti-AKA bias, which they clearly have. These people are spreading disinformation as surely as I'm sitting here talking to you tonight, and they should be ignored. And to the extent that it's possible, called out for what they're doing. I know that, in discussions that we have had with the Indonesian ministries, there is a plan in place to protect the 200,000 plus families who rely exclusively on Kratom harvesting and processing for their livelihoods. And the government in Indonesia is going to protect them. And the government in Indonesia has conducted their own independent studies on the safety of Kratom. And I think you will shortly see the announcements made by the appropriate ministries there that they have concluded that Kratom, just like the FDA failed to prove that it was dangerous, they're going to announce that Kratom is not a dangerous substance and therefore isn't subject to the restrictions that the BNN is attempting to put forth. But we have to be aware of these purveyors of disinformation within our own community. Now, I get it, there are other issues. I get it, there are people who criticize the AK because of the tactics of what we do or don't do. There's always room for criticism. And by the way, there's room for improvement on our end. We listen. We try to be responsive to legitimate concerns, and sometimes we get it wrong. There's no question about that. We've tried a couple of things that have just failed, but it's not because we lack good faith to it. It's because we're trying hard to win as many battles as we can on behalf of the Kratom consuming public that deserves to have an unfettered access to make informed decisions about the products they use, including Kratom products here in the United States. Our commitment remains strong to that. We will only recognize those criticisms when they're offered in a manner that's coherent, and many of the criticisms I've seen are incoherent, expressed by individuals that have serious issues that have nothing to do with Kratom, but only about their own grievances that they want to grind against perceived wrongs that they've expressed, that the FDA hasn't properly recognized them, or the AK has not properly taken advantage of their ideas. Some of it's resource-based. We don't have time or the resource money to do many of the ideas that otherwise are excellent. Some of them are just complaints, and they're just mean, and you'll have to evaluate those on your own. We welcome them. We recognize that people have the right to express their opinions, but opinions don't mean they're factual. And we would hope that that when these grievances or complaints are issued, that they're based on accurate facts rather than just some outstanding bias that they may have against it. I apologize to anyone for offense that I may have provided. Again, we're trying hard to carry this battle. It's not easy. It requires the support of this community, and we're grateful for all of you who make the financial sacrifice to help. Otherwise, we couldn't get the experts in front of the legislative bodies and the public policy bodies that we have to work with on a consistent basis. These are not cheap things. Just as a simple matter, in the last year, airfares have gone up over 30%. That adds an additional expense onto to our budgets in order to get these experts in front of these committees. And we know that when that opportunity is available, we win. So I thank everyone. These are important efforts that we're all involved in collectively. I hope that we can welcome those that are critics back into the fold, and that we can work together and cooperatively in going forward. So, and I'll just conclude with this. These are not going to be easy discussions in some cases. We find people that honestly believe that Kratom was responsible for an adverse event or a death in their family. Many of you may have seen the report on the legal case that came out of Florida. And I only know a couple of things that happened in that case. One, the manufacturer did not show up to defend themselves. And so they got a judgment in absentia against them. It was a significant judgment. If looking at just the description of the products that were used, it does not appear that those products were adherent to in any way the KCPA or any reasonable labeling restriction. There wasn't much labeling, if any, on the products, and the naming of the products and the packaging and the content of them leads us to suspect that there may have been an adulterated kratom product. But that being the case, we need to unify behind a message that speaks truth, recognizes when we don't know something, but recognizing that the experts have concluded after a complete evaluation of all of the evidence and data that has been provided that kratom is not subject to scheduling, and that since it's not, we need to regulate it because of the persistent problems in the marketplace of innovators who are stretching the limits and adulterating the products to give the natural kratom product a euphoric high or a kick that it doesn't have naturally. And they only do that.
Mac, you're on mute.
Sorry, you lost me for a minute. I think the FDA was monitoring this and they cut me off. What do you think? That'd be a good conspiracy theory, right? It might just be my home internet. Anyway, so they opened up for questions. I see that Senator Bramble's joined us, a champion in this space. Glad to turn it over to him if he's got any additional comments before we go to Q&A.
Well, the one thing that I would point out, Mac, you've done a great job outlining the issue and the efforts. There is no substitute for individual citizens, for constituents of legislators to tell their personal stories. When we were in Baton Rouge testifying, the testimony of I think it was Special Forces, former military, suffering from PSTD, and talking about how he had been suicidal and whatever, and that kratom saved his life. That turned the sponsor of the ban bill, who was also former military. That personal story resonated, and that happens. We see that time and time and time again. We're in a battle. This is a mission that we're on, but we're in a battle against a very powerful adversary. The FDA doesn't play fair. They are not honest in their approach, and they're pulling out the stops to do everything they can. We're going to win this, but it takes all hands on deck. It takes everyone, whether you're a vendor, a manufacturer, a user, or someone that's sympathetic to the potential that kratom has in a host of areas. It's all hands on deck. So thanks, Mac.
Thank you. So Ryan, I'll turn it back to you and we can go through any questions anyone has.
That's great. Thank you, Senator. And thank you, Mac, as always. Our first question this evening, and first of all, a lot of comments in tonight's Q&A. I want to thank you for the very kind words and stories that are shared there. But getting to the questions, where do you see Pennsylvania working on the act?
So we had a great informational hearing with the Pennsylvania Joint Health and House Senate and Health Committee. It was absolutely fabulous, well received. I think that there is a recognition among the legislative leaders there that we need to, it's given that we can't schedule it because science does not permit that we need to have a good regulatory plan. I think we're in good shape in Pennsylvania.
Perfect. And what time are the Louisiana House hearings tomorrow so I can watch? I'm assuming that's still at 1 o'clock.
Well, the House goes into session at 1 o'clock, and then it depends on where we are on the agenda. It could be hours, but the bill will be up tomorrow. They've restated the fiscal note again, I think, but we're under the $500,000 threshold that requires referral to the Appropriations Committee, and that's what we had to avoid. So we're working hard. The sheriffs got to the fiscal note committee, and they had this ridiculous fiscal note on it because all of these fees, the legitimate fees, are covered by the fees and registration fees that are paid by the vendors, and any testing is paid by the vendors. And the model that works is true in Utah. Utah did it in 2019 with a fiscal note of $172,000, and they haven't needed any more money since. This is a self-funding program that works. It's the model self-regulation that every state should embrace.
Great. And any word on when the KCPA will start being enacted in Colorado?
So the KCPA becomes effective on July 1st, I believe. The Department of Revenue failed to get the report to the legislature in an acceptable form that would have provided more regulatory structure around it, mainly because we disagreed with them. They were just trying to do what the FDA wants, and we were able to fight that back and even had the governor's support on that. So the KCPA will go in effect. It's not going to have the regulatory framework we would like, but it's not going to be a ban, and it's not going to give something for the Department of Revenue to come after us because they failed to meet their obligation.
Louisiana Senator Fred Mills is married to my brother-in-law's sister. I've talked to him about this before, but no bill had been submitted yet. In Louisiana, what would be the best approach for me to talk to him and get him engaged on this issue?
Get us on a call together. Relationships are important. Those are important connections, and I'd love to have that conversation with the senator.
And has there been any luck finding proof of Kratom commerce before Deshay?
So all of you should have seen the renewed appeal that we put out to ask people to search through relationships, records about Kratom use in commerce in the United States prior to 1994, October 15th, 94, which is the magic date created by the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act. If you have any information, I know we've all talked about this ad nauseum, let's renew our efforts, let's look for it and see if we can find it. We're actually making some progress. We have promising leads. We have to authenticate some of it. It is possible that we'll win this battle just based on the proof that Kratom was in fact, which we all know to be true, was in fact in commerce in the United States prior to that magic cutoff date.
Great. And what is happening in South Carolina?
The ban bill that was proposed in South Carolina was done by a legislator whom I had a great conversation with. He's a very decent guy. He recognized that there were two sides to the story. And so the cutoff date, the crossover date for bills to be enacted in one chamber to go to the other, in this case will be the House and the Senate, came and went without any action. We're going to have a healthy discussion over the interim on the Kratom Consumer Protection Act, but South Carolina's ban bills are dead unless there is an unprecedented change before they adjourn. Now, they may have already adjourned, I think, but if they haven't, it's not going to be a problem. We have assurances that there's no procedural way under regular order for the ban bills to be resurrected. So we're in good shape in South Carolina.
I don't know that we know much on this, but I just saw a seizure. I saw the seizure of that $3 million shipment recently. Was that legal and just state related, or can they do that anywhere?
The FDA has the authority to do that anywhere they damn well please, and they likely will. They're going to ramp up their attacks on Kratom every way that they can, which is why when the federal Kratom Consumer Protection Act gets filed and then adjudicated there, it's going to limit the FDA's authority to do import alerts for exactly what it was intended, to only interdict contaminants for which the FDA has the burden to prove that there is a contamination of the raw material. In this case, it would be E. coli, salmonella, that kind of thing, or heavy metals. What the FDA is doing is saying that their import alert authority allows them to ban a product if it doesn't get an NDIN, which under the statute it's not required to unless they want to use a structured function claim. So that's where we have a disagreement, and I hope that the courts will see that clearly, that they've overreached and it's an abuse of their authority.
Great. And any updates on Kentucky?
Kentucky had a short fiscal session this year, so we didn't get any action on the KCPA, but we have lobbyists in place, and we're talking to some new co-sponsors in Kentucky. Very promising. We've had great conversations. I think we're going to hit the ground running early in 2024.
And can you update us on the strengthening of the KCPA in Nevada? I've been trying to follow the bill, but confused on where it stands.
Well, I admit I'm a little confused too. Nevada's been a little bit of a tough slog. We have the KCPA in place. What we want to do is limit the ability of the Board of Pharmacy to try to schedule it. And part of the bill that we have does that. The other part is to give more framework to the KCPA so that we can interdict adulterated products and contaminated products. And that's the battle that we're in right now. We had discussions today. We're looking for the right regulatory agency to do that. The Department of Oriental Medicine said no. The Department of Agriculture said no. We're now looking at Department of Revenue, and we're looking at some of the framework for doing that, but we're making some progress there. But we have the KCPA fundamentally in place. We may have to go back and fight the Board of Pharmacy, but the Board of Pharmacy actions, even if they take them to ban kratom, have to be approved by the Legislative Commission, which is chaired by Speaker Yeager. And Speaker Yeager is a great proponent for the Kratom Consumer Protection Act, having sponsored it originally in the Nevada legislature.
Perfect. And will you guys be emailing the list of Louisiana legislators who are on board for the KCPA? We did through a Facebook campaign, and we can certainly recirculate that.
When it goes to the House Committee, Judiciary Committee group, we'll launch that in the next day or so. We're going to need to hit them hard because they're the ones who voted for the ban bill on an 8-7 vote. And there was some information that wasn't available to them, which we hope will be. So we're going to be launching an advocacy campaign to help inform the members of that committee how important it is. We're going to wait and see how the KCPA fares tomorrow. And then if we get it passed out of the House, then we have a trade-off that we can work with.
And then how is the KCPA going in New York?
It's going great. New York's a funny place. They don't hold hearings that allow the citizens to come and comment. But we have David Carlucci, who is a former New York State Senator, who's our lead lobbyist there. He's doing a terrific job. He's lining up support, working methodically with members of both the House and the Senate. We've been cooperating in meetings with him. I think that the sentiment of the legislature there is regulation is important, and I think we're going to be successful in New York.
That's great. And a question if Maryland would be available to testify.
So Maryland is currently on a professorship in waiting or in absentia in Italy for another 2.5, 3 weeks. So she's been unavailable to travel to testify for us. She's obviously fabulous. We just haven't been able to use her because she's over in Italy on this visiting professor gig that she's involved. I've been tempted to call them and tell the university and tell them that Maryland's just a terrible person and they should kick her out. But I haven't brought myself to that yet. But we need her, obviously, where we can use her.
And a question about Alton, Illinois, and Ryan, I don't have the latest on that. A few of these comments too, just as I always share, my email is ryan@americankratom.org. Please send me some of those specifics and I will follow up with you on these. I know Alton has been floating around there over the last week and I'm not quite sure where they stand. Is there a rough guess when the federal KCPA may be filed?
Not a rough guess. I can tell you that we hope to get it here before they start the summer recess. The FDA is working hard against this, and we're getting a lot of kickback and resolving those issues, but it's very methodical. We now have 8 potential primary co-sponsors in the House that will complement Representative Pocan. So we're making progress, just been a little slower than I'd like.
And is there an update on Vermont? What's the process and likely time frame for Vermont consumers aren't felons? Thanks for all you do.
So first off, the Vermont Department of Health accepted the petition filed by the American Kratom Association on March 1st to remove metrogenine and 7-hydroxymetrogenine from the drug list. So that was done. They will proceed with rulemaking immediately following the adjournment sine die of the Vermont legislature. We've been in negotiations with the chairman of the Department of Health. She wants the drug rule to be finalized, and then so the kratom's completely off the drug list, and then she will work with our allies to pass the Kratom Consumer Protection Act. Vermont's a multi-year session, so the bill's filed and it will simply be heard later this year and then acted on early next year after the Vermont Department of Health. So today, until the drug rule process is completed, technically I would guess that it's illegal, other than the announcement that they've removed it, in which I don't think there'll be any prosecution on it. But we want the sale of kratom to be able to be legal in the state of Vermont, and that will require the rulemaking to be completed by the Department of Health in Vermont.
Great, thanks, Mac. And I believe our last question, where are things standing in Michigan? Any new news from there?
So in Michigan, we've got a great advocate in the House. We've got the legislative leadership helping us. We have a problem with the governor, and the governor's listening to the boogeyman in Washington, D.C., the FDA. So we're in discussions with them, trying to explain how the FDA is wrong. And if they want to look to anyone, they should go to the National Institute on Drug Abuse and look at their position on it. And more compelling is the fact that the FDA can't schedule it. So why would Michigan schedule it? Or why would Michigan not have if you don't have a schedule, why wouldn't you be in a position to regulate it so you protect against adulterated products or contaminated products and unlabeled products? So that's where we are right now.
That's great, Mac. That's all I'm seeing for questions. Maybe. Let's see. One final question here. How do we stand in Missouri?
In Missouri, the governor, again, told the legislature he will veto it again. He's unmoved on this issue. We were unable to get a vote count that gave us a 2/3 override simply because the Senate didn't want to embarrass the governor. We may end up having to wait for this governor to be out. And that would be not this coming to 24, but in 25. Very disappointing there. I can tell you that Phil Cristofanelli, who is our champion, our advocate, who's a member of the House, who likely will be in the state Senate next year, he's a warrior. We need to continue to pursue this so that we can bring this across the finish line. Very disappointing in Missouri right now.
Okay, and I believe we've covered everything else. Mac, do you have any closing comments?
Just to say thank you. Thank you to everyone. And you know, truthfully, we appreciate even the input from our critics. I said that earlier. I mean it. I think that all of us ought to be willing to have a conversation and discuss those differences. It's when you take the attacks on social media, or in the case of some of the Kratom danger awareness, where they make ridiculous attacks on us, name calling, that kind of thing. It's just inappropriate. It doesn't get us anywhere. But we're going to continue to work on building relationships and offer a hand of help where it's necessary and appropriate. And we want to continue to do that. We'll try to set aside the vitriol that has permeated some of these folks, and understandably in the cases of some who've lost loved ones, where they feel aggrieved because of the bad information they've gotten from people that they think they can trust. And unfortunately, and I'll say it again, they're even from our worst critics at NMS Labs. And there's a recent paper that was published where they admitted that they don't know a toxic level for Kratom. So how in the world can any coroner or medical examiner draw a conclusion that a death was caused by Kratom intoxication when there's no scientific standard to prove that, and plenty of evidence that contradicts that conclusion? So that's the fundamental battle that we're involved in right now. But it's a sidebar to the other issue, which is, while these issues are being resolved, we need to regulate Kratom and take the adulterated Kratom off the marketplace, and those products ought to be eliminated. And consumers ought to have the protection of knowing when they buy a Kratom product that they know it's going to be well manufactured, because they use good manufacturing standards, it's properly labeled, and that it is age limited. We think that's appropriate. That's the solution to this problem, and we're looking for a solution, not just to be in a fight.
That's great, Mac. Thank you very much. And thank you all. Again, my email is ryan@americankratom.org. And I'm quite certain we'll be in touch here in the next couple of weeks with another update, given how fast everything's moving. Have a great evening.
Thanks, everyone.
Enjoy your weekend.